We're about ready. The video guy is almost there.
Hey, we ought to applaud as it comes up. You're really applauding just for the heck of it. Yay! Hooray!
Entertainment industry people from the West Coast.
We're going?
Oh, we're going now. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to have the chair of the actual conference here, Paul Smith, is going to kind of run things up here, this panel discussion. It's an historic event. I'll let Paul do the introductions because he can actually talk about these people from personal experience and give them the respect and introduction that they deserve. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you. Well, folks, this is actually a continuation of something we did last year on a very informal basis. And as you can see, we're continuing it in that very informal vein. So, I don't know. Is my microphone on? Is there, I didn't find a switch on here. Hello? Am I on? The wonders of modern technology? Wonders of modern... Hello? Hello? Hello?
Okay, not my fault.
Not my fault. All right, who kicked the plug? There's got to be a kick plug here somewhere. I didn't find a switch. Is there one on there?
Some wireless. Try it now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? This is a continuation of a thing we did last year. Kind of an informal walk down memory lane, you might say. We got an oral history of remote viewing. Not in great detail, but kind of get the sequences of events right. Each of us conversing amongst ourselves, because we all have a different part of the history here. And some things one person remembers, somebody else remembers differently. And the goal is to sort out what actually happened when and who did what to whom, as much as that's possible to do. Okay? And last year, we didn't have near the stellar attendance that we have this year as far as presenters and celebrities and stuff. But we did have Russell Targ, Skip Atwater, Mel Riley, and myself up here doing this little walk down memory lane. And Stephen Schwartz, who's right over here, jumped in on a number of occasions with some very enlightening pieces of information that none of the rest of us knew about this. So we hope to have that same effect this year. So we've started off up here with the same set of folks that were here last year with the addition of Ingo Swann. And what we're going to do at this point, how we're going to work this is, as people entered or left the program along the chronology of the program, we're going to have people go down into the audience and come up from the audience to sit up here, okay? So at this point, we ended in 1982, all right? We're going to give a brief review of that first 10 years of the program, very brief, and then we're going to make a kind of a participant change briefly, and then take up from 1982 and move on. We are not going to entertain questions from the audience until the very end. So if you have a question that you are dying to ask, you better write it on the back of your hand, on your neighbor's shirt collar, whatever, so that you don't forget it. Okay, are the rules clear so far? We have one microphone so that we don't have 5 people trying to put in their input all at once, and instead of that we'll just have 5 people trying to jerk the mic out of each other's hands. Okay, so very briefly, of course the one up here who predated everyone as far as the official program is concerned is probably Ingo Swann. We're not going to pass him the mic yet. I'll get more time to think about what I want to say.
Say probably either.
I'm sorry, not probably, definitely did. Okay, now we started last time with, as I remember, 1972. We mentioned Ingo. that he'd been participating in experiments and things like that. And we'll let him talk about that a little bit here in a minute. And then we talked about how Ingo and Hal got together. Now, that is one of the things we're celebrating this time. On the 6th of June, 1972, was when the experiment was done in the basement of the Stanford University Physics Building that ultimately attracted the attention of the CIA, which resulted in the government program, which resulted in this huge interest in the end on remote viewing and its potential and what can be done with it. Okay, so that experiment occurred 30 years ago last week, okay, and shortly after that, Hal and Ingo, of course, got the thing off the ground as far as the project is concerned. Russell came in and got involved and was integrated in the program and played a major role with it as well. Now, one thing happened more or less concurrently with Hal's and Ingo's experiment, and that's something Russell wanted to clarify here. I'll let him talk about it for a minute. He did talk about it last year, but we need it here because it's not in the timeline that was in the aperture, and so we need to add it.
Thank you, Paul. My beginning introduction to the program was to attend a lecture at Stanford University that Hal gave in April of 1972. Hal was giving a talk to a student group on what do we know about parapsychology, and his abstract in the newspaper sounded a whole lot like talks I was giving on the same subject. So I met Hal at Stanford in April, and he told me that he had a little research effort at SRI, and he'd like to look into parapsychology there. And I told him that I was invited to talk to a conference that NASA was giving on speculative technology on St. Simon's Island the next month. So I went off to St. Simon's Island off the coast of Georgia. This is in May of '72, and had a chance to meet Edgar Mitchell and Wernher von Braun and Jim Fletcher, who was the administrator of NASA. And we stood out on the pier, and in Miracles of Mind, I call this my peer group meeting, because we had Wernher von Braun and Jim Fletcher, and I got a chance to give them my pitch for what an ESP program would be in my mind. That was to build an ESP teaching machine and to do brainwave experiments to show that people's brainwaves changed when they were being psychic. Von Braun sold the program for me. The reason we're here today is that Wernher von Braun had a psychic grandmother, and von Braun told Jim Fletcher, my grandmother was so psychic, everybody in my community went to her, and on, and Fletcher turned toward his administrator, George Pesdertz, and said, give him some money. George Pesdertz was a new projects administrator at NASA, and he was our great supporter through many years, both from personal interest and his many trips to SRI, so that in June of 1972, I came to SRI, but I was not very important because I came with Edgar Mitchell, who had just walked on the moon and was starting Noetic Sciences, and I came with George Pesdertz, who promised us money, which came, but it took almost another year. But we came with a great promise of NASA money to do ESP at SRI. So we had a fateful meeting in August of '72 with Hal and me and Willis Harmon and Edgar Mitchell and George Pesdertz and Charlie Anderson, who is the surprisingly courageous president of SRI, because Anderson was not at all interested in psychic stuff, but we had all these heavy hitters with us, and he said, if you promise to behave yourself and not give us a lot of bad publicity, we could start a program. And the following month, September, I joined SRI. Hal already had an ongoing activity with Ingo, and from my point of view, it was a promise of NASA money together with the subsequent CIA money that gave us both the financial and the prestige quantity so that we could start the program.
Thank you. Ingo, you want to take up here? Just skip a little bit about the beginning? Nope? Okay. All right, good. Well, on that note, let's see. This is too complex. I think what we're going to have to do, we'll ask Mel to sit down because in 1981 he left the unit. He'll be back up here. He'll be back up here. And I think we need Hal and Dale. Let's see, where's my list? Hal and Dale. Russell's here and go, okay. Okay, good. Hal and Dale. I can scoot over a little more if we need to. No, we're okay. Okay, good. Now, this is somewhat training we covered last year, but since neither Hal nor Dale were here at the time, actually, Dale's here perhaps a little early, but that's okay. I'm going to pass the mic to Hal and have him give us a brief soundbite chronology here of what he wants to say as far as the beginning of the program and how it progressed up through 1980-81. Okay?
I'd graduated from Stanford in '67 and stayed on till '72 working on a textbook that we finally put out, and then came to SRI in the spring of '72. And while I'd worked on the textbook, I learned what people always learn when they write textbooks, and that is there's a lot they don't know. And one of the things that actually caught my attention was that although physics was great for explaining lasers, which is what our textbook was about, it didn't say anything about the life process. And so I was musing over whether, physics was going to be up to including living things or whether we're going to have a new science. And about that time, somebody gave me a copy of Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain by Ostrander and Schroeder. And I read that, and one of the things that caught my attention was, first, there were a lot of very highly placed PhD level people in the Soviet Union that were looking into psychic things, even though in this country, who could care less? And secondly, they had talked in detail about a number of experiments called the Baxter effect, and Cleve Baxter is here in the audience, where people appeared to affect plants at a distance and so on. And so I thought, well, maybe there's some physics there, because here you got something, possibly measurable, because they were talking about putting electrodes on plants, people affecting the plants from a distance, getting a signal. So it occurred to me that, well, maybe there's something here, and we could learn some physics. So I wrote up a proposal to circulate around to see if I could generate any interest in trying to expand physics to include living processes. And I sent a copy to Cleve. Now, so it turned out that Cleve and Ingo had met at a social event, and Ingo was invited by Cleve to come over and see if he could affect his plants. And while he was there, he saw my proposal on the desk. And so he wrote me a letter and said, well, if you're interested in this, you ought to have a psychic come, like me. And along with his letter, he provided some evidence that we don't use the word psychic. He provided some really excellent evidence of experiments that he'd done with Gertrude Schmeidler at City College in New York, where he had affected a temperature measuring instrument and so on. So although I hadn't particularly thought along those lines, I decided, well, what the heck, just on a lark, I'd invite him out. So I started talking to my physics colleagues around SRI, well, what do you think we should do, and so on, and they said, oh, these people are all frauds and charlatans. I mean, you really got to be careful. So I arranged to use a magnetometer that was being used to try to detect the presence of quarks in the physics department. And this was a magnificent instrument. It was in a vault below the floor. It had magnetic shielding, it had electrical shielding, it had superconducting shielding. And so the idea was this thing was totally imperturbable from the outside, so that if there were evidence of quarks, which would be indicated by some magnetic fields changing inside the device, you know, that would really be something. But it's imperturbable from the outside. So I go, okay, this is perfect. So Ingo shows up, and I say, well, you know, hey, you were able to affect this thermistor in a thermos bottle. I've got something sort of like that. So I took him over there. I said, well, here it is. You know, where is it? Well, it's below the floor. And it's superconducting shielded, but don't let that bother you. I'd like to see if you could, you know, perturb it. And it was only later I found out that probably the shock of what I requested turned on his abilities in strong order. So what he said was, well, you'll get your turn. So what he says, well, let me see what's in there. And I said, well, no, we can't take it apart. I mean, it's on. No, I mean, I'm just going to look inside and see. So anyway, the instrument is sitting there, and it's kind of doing its thing, putting out. I'll have this as part of my talk tomorrow night. You'll see the actual output of the instrument. It's just putting out a nice sort of sine wave thing. And as he, quote, looks in there, it goes bananas. And so I say, oh, you're affecting it. He said, no, I'm just looking to see what's there. And so I asked him, well, you know, do that again. He said, well, I'm just looking. And when he looked, it happened again. So of course, the poor graduate student whose PhD depended on this said, oh, you know, something must be wrong with my instrument. So he said, well, you guys, go eat lunch or something. And so we went to eat lunch, and I said, and Ingo, don't think about it while we're eating lunch. And he didn't, and it went fine. So I thought this was very interesting. I wrote it up. I started circulating it around. I had 2 visits. First, the people from the Office of Naval Research, who had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for this instrument to be built, showed up and said, why was this perturbed from the outside? That's what we paid for this thing not to be. So that was one problem. And then secondly, as I'll get into more detail in my talk tomorrow evening, people from the CIA showed up and said, oh, we've been looking for you. I knew I was in trouble. But it's because of my intelligence background. I had been a naval intelligence officer, and I'd been stationed at NSA. They knew all the clearances I had had. By the way, I left there because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing classified work. So the next 13 years of my life turned into doing classified work. But based on that, as I'll give a little more detail tomorrow, they said, well, we'd like to sort of see some of this stuff for ourselves. So would Ingo mind if, like, we hid things in boxes? And, you know, he could come in the room and tell us what they are. And so I have to tell you, Ingo did a sterling run. They even put something in the box, and Ingo said, well, there's this leaf in the box, but what I don't understand is it's moving around. Well, they put a walking stick in the box. So based on that, they said, okay, we need to go with this. And so that's basically how the program got started with agency funding. Now, people often look back, or have bugged me since, and said, you know, I mean, this was 60s and the 70s, and everybody hated the CIA, and why would you do this, and so on. But my own personal view was, after having been in intelligence and reading lots of documents about intelligence, it was really clear to me, or part of my brainwashing, depending on how you want to look at it, that whenever we had wars, it's because we had poor intelligence. And whenever we had good intelligence, we managed to avert war. So the idea that, you know, it might be worth pursuing this for intelligence purposes, as far as I was concerned, that was a vote for peace. And so that I was certainly enthusiastic about taking it up. I still thought it would be a small piece of the program, of my overall laser program and so on. But it grew and grew and grew. And over the years, we got more and more clients, some of which still can't be named. They were tripping over each other. And so finally, it got to the point where DIA finally said, now wait a minute, you're working for them, and you're working for them, and you're working for them, and they want you to do the same things. So then they moved into a position of taking over kind of an oversight. And then the program developed for many years there. There's also another part of this that we don't usually discuss, but there are a lot of specific incidents which I know you'd be interested in that happened along the way that just never make it into the book. So I'll just give you one example. After we generated some positive results, we were invited in to present it to a group at the CIA that we were working for at the time. And so we were going through these results, and suddenly some guy in the audience, about 30 people in the room, leaps up and says, wait a minute, I know what's going on here. This is a psychological test to test gullibility, and whoever's taking notes, I want you to know, I'm not buying. And he stomped out of the room. There are a lot of stories like that, but we should go on.
Do you want equal time?
I was just going to say something about that CIA meeting briefly. All right. Eventually, we had a general who was in the back of the room who stayed to the end and said, I don't know about this remote viewing stuff. This just looks to me like simple mental telepathy. It was part of our continuing communication problem. With regard to working for the CIA, Hal and I were both laser physicists at that time, and our general feeling as scientists is that, given the choice, we were in favor of intelligence as compared with ignorance, and that's what moved us to work for the CIA.
What shall I say?
I don't know.
What do you-
Your side of the story.
Yeah, go ahead.
My side of the story. Well, let's see. Tomorrow I'm going to give a lecture, a big, long, heavy-duty lecture. And so I don't want to say too much now. But actually, this project that these two are talking about actually began in Cleve Baxter's lab in very early 1971. And then it went to Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler at City College in New York, and we did a lovely influencing thermometers there. And then it went to the ASPR in early 1972. And by the middle of 1972, I had succeeded in just about everything and was already headline news before I ever heard of these two guys. Is anybody here familiar with the theory of fractals? Here comes a little incident here that does this, and there's unpredictable offshoots from that. And then there's more unpredictable offshoots from that. And then there's more unpredictable offshoots from this until you get this whole universe of fractals. Well, I think that I was the original fractile. And frankly, now that I'm pushing 70 years old, I get a little irritated when people forget that.
Well, we're going to segue up a little bit here. If you want the in-between stuff, you can get the tape from last year. But I want to now take advantage of having Dale Graff here. In 1975, I think fairly late in 75, mid-75, somewhere in there, the CIA decided that they didn't want to be involved in the remote viewing program anymore. And in fact, I'm going to actually hand this to Hal first to kind of say how the CIA got out of it and why. And then I'd like him to hand it on to Dale Graff to tell us a bit about his role in it, understanding that he's going to talk about it a little bit tomorrow. So again, soundbite. Okay, just a little bit so that we can put it all in context.
We had our program at the agency 72 to 75, and they were very happy with what we were doing, actually. But it turns out we had the misfortune that we were working for part of the agency, the Office of Technical Services, which was being investigated about that time by the church committee. And it turned out that they had supplied disguises for the Ellsberg break-in. They had kept shellfish toxin back when they shouldn't have. And they had this long, that's where MK Ultra had gotten its wings and failed in many ways. And so while they were under this spotlight, the new agency head called in the people from OTS and said, "Are you guys still doing anything weird that we could get in trouble for?" And so they had to admit that they were. And so they put two and two together and said, "Oh my gosh, remote viewing, MK Ultra, mind control, this sounds like we don't want to go there any further." Don't you ever learn? And so we were actually hand carried off to other people to look for funding by the people at the working level. They still wanted to see us go on, but they just wanted somebody else to take the heat for it. And so that's how we eventually made changes off into other directions and with other sponsors. Although over the years, the CIA was still one of the major customers of the program, regardless of who we were actually reporting to. So they never lost interest. And we always, eventually toward the end of the program, or toward the end of my participation in the program, right before like 1985, I even ended up briefing Casey, who was then director of CIA, for a half-hour meeting. He canceled the rest of his afternoon, and we spent about 4.5 hours. And he was absolutely entranced with what he was hearing. And of course, by that time, we'd accumulated a tremendous amount of data. And also, as you probably know, eventually, Pat Price, actually, who's also one of our remote viewers at SRI, actually went to work for the agency and worked for them on a number of operational cases. So they didn't lose interest, but they sure did lose wanting to take the heat for it.
I guess it's time to acknowledge who took the heat. There you go. That was not PK. A little bit of body language. My involvement in this activity has a lot of twists and fractals. I graduated with a degree in aeronautical engineering in 1956 and 8 years in aerospace industries. And then had an opportunity to join this very interesting organization called the Foreign Technology Division, located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Well, I thought this would be kind of interesting to apply my aerospace knowledge to solving problems of intelligence and figuring out what the Soviet Union was doing. The charter at FTD, the Foreign Technology Division, was to assess foreign missile, space, and command and control capability. And like Hal, I had wrestled too with the issue of, do I want to move into the intelligence community or not? I could have stayed in the aerospace. But I had this feeling of threat. The agency at FTD and the whole intelligence community's fundamental goal is to prevent surprise. And I know the press twists that around and gives us all kinds of bad image. But I really believed in that. And if I could apply my technology knowledge, my aerospace engineering, to anticipating the next Soviet missile, then I felt I was making a contribution. So I was at the Foreign Technology Division from 1974 onward until I left there in 1981. In 1970, while at FTD, and going through some technology reports, I came across some very interesting material in the Soviet electrical engineering journals, written by a professor of information theory. And he explained his ESP experiments. This is Professor Kogan. I became very interested. How could a scientist with this kind of reputation be publishing in a technical journal when I hadn't seen anything like this in the US? So I wrote up a summary of that and collected other information. I got interested in the topic for a number of reasons, and I'll explain some of them tomorrow in more detail. But I wrote the report. It took probably several iterations before I got it into one of my publications. And I had the responsibility at that time for publishing trends and forecast studies for the U.S. Air Force for technical intelligence projections out 20 years. And I included parapsychology and Kogan's work in one of those chapters. I was called in by the commander, and I thought I was going to get chewed out. But no, he said, this is very interesting stuff. Keep following this work. This is around 1975. And around that time, through fortuitous circumstances, we had visitors named Dr. Harold Putoff and Russell Targ from SRI that briefed on the remote viewing programs that they had been sponsored by the CIA. And that briefing, and I believe the Soviet work that had been uncovered by myself and my colleagues, was the impetus for getting the Department of Defense to pick up the ball, so to speak. And through the Air Force, through the Department of Defense, we then came forth with some year-end funding. In fact, this was the fastest contract I was ever able to get online. And it was called year-end funding. And the timing of your visit was right at the time when we needed to grab hold of this little excess funding that we had to keep the program alive. And our commander was very much in favor of moving forward and exploring the work at SRI and seeing where remote viewing could take us from a technical point of view, because we were a technical organization. We had a lot of physicists and engineers, and also from an applied point of view. In the Air Force, if there are hostages missing, there are prisoners of wars out there somewhere in the Saigon area. So they had lots of potential for Air Force applications. So for a number of various reasons, I was able to move into supporting this work. I was appointed the contract manager. So I became the first Department of Defense contract manager for remote viewing research. And we were able to continue this work for several more years before certain catastrophes happened that I'll go into tomorrow in more detail. And I moved down to the Defense Intelligence Agency to continue the work there and to continue my connection with them. There's just one other link I want to make, and that occurred back in 1974. This is around the time I already had discovered the foreign work, particularly Kogan and a few others, and I got looking into the whole region, the whole area of parapsychology. And I discovered a number of activities in this country as well. Dr. Ryan's work at the Duke Parapsychology Lab, and work that was very dear to my heart that I'll explain tomorrow. The dream telepathy work at the Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm going to go into a little bit of that tomorrow and explain why that has an impact on my interest in the field and my eventual connection with remote viewing research. And then one more link, in 1974, I had a chance to facilitate an honorary program to honor Dr. Edgar Mitchell at a physics university, at the Drexel University in Philadelphia, through the physics lab. He was awarded the Engineering Award of the Year. And the reason we brought him in there, and I was connected with the university there at the time, was to acknowledge his contribution to space and to acknowledge his ESP experiment from space that occurred just a few months earlier. And this was the first open recognition of ESP from space that I'm aware of. And this was actually delivered by the president of the university at that honorary event. And while I was there, I was fortunate enough to have detailed talks with Dr. Mitchell, and he let me on to something else that had a very big impact on me. And at that time, he had just written a foreword to a book that became very popular many years earlier, which I hadn't heard of before. It was called Thoughts Through Space by Harold Sherman. It was one of the first documented long-distance ESP remote viewing type experiments ever done. And later on, I was able to connect with Harold Sherman to replicate that experiment to some degree. So I've had a number of different tracks into this field. And I was fortunate enough to come in and help pick up the pieces and help promote the continuation of not only the research, but later on the applications as well in an area which I believe is certainly pushing the paradigm. And I think we all can share of this new paradigm push that we were able to start decades ago.
Thanks, Dale. Appreciate it. One question I wanted clarification. You got the contract, the end of your funds contract was end of 1975?
It was money that came in 1976.
Okay, but it was awarded at the end of 1975. So what would you say the date that you guys essentially picked up sponsorship? 1976, the first part of 1976. Okay, good. Just for the chronology. Okay, good. And then you left Air Force and went to DIA under 1981. Okay, the timeline in here isn't perfect, guys, so you can make changes as you go. Dale, I hope we'll talk tomorrow about his circumstance of leaving Air Force and going to DIA, because it was not exactly the most pleasant sort of a deal. Okay, good. We're going to cut a few corners here because we did cover this stuff last year, and I'm going to mention in 1977, Skip Atwater was instrumental in getting the Army into the act. Getting the Army program started. At that point it was called Gondola Wish, that was his first name. Shortly thereafter it became known as Grill Flame, and we'll get to the next stage of it here in a minute. Okay, 1977 the Army program started, 1981 Dale went to DIA. 1982 Russell left SRI, but then went on to further career highlights in remote viewing. I guess we'd call it the private sector, I guess for want of any other better term, okay? And that kind of brings us up to date where about this time Mel Riley has left the Army unit. Joe McMonigal is still there. I'm trying to think of who the folks are you guys know. Skip Atwater, of course, is still there. And, I'm sorry?
Ken Bell was there.
Ken Bell was still there. Most of them don't know Ken Bell. Yeah, Ken Bell was still there. And at this point, I'm going to pass this back to Hal and Ingo, because they were still at SRI, and maybe you can tell us some of the highlights that were occurring around 1982. Okay.
You mentioned 79. In 79, we trained the first group of
Yeah. Trying to remember which things are not still classified. Yeah, about 1979 is when we began training the Army remote viewers, and Ingo was the trainer, and we did a full court press on trying to understand exactly what the pitfalls in remote viewing were, where the strengths were, what order the data came in. And this is basically a development that's entirely due to Ingo, as many of you know. And we learned a lot of interesting things. First of all, remote viewing is probably not the best word. Maybe it should be remote sensing. I don't know if he's going to, are you going to go through stages of the... Briefly, okay. That actually data tends to come in at the kinesthetic level and drawing and making sketches. That this was a whole new kind of thing. But as a result of peeling away and learning how to separate analytical overlay from the signal line and how the signal line comes in stages, Ingo developed that into a replicable procedure. And we were able to work with new people, and Ingo would take them through the stages, and they would actually turn out extremely good data. So based on that's when we got into sort of the training mode. So about that time, there were a lot of things going on in the world, the Iranian hostage case, all kinds of concerns about Soviet technologies and so on. So in the early 80s, mid-80s, a lot of the work, even at SRI, that was supposed to be research, was in fact on operational things. And so as time would go on, we just have people shuffling in and out from various agencies with tasks. I remember some funny things. We were supposed to see, well, how good would timing be? And so it turned out there were some rocket tests in the Nevada desert. And
I love this one.
so some days there would be a test, some days there wouldn't.
It wasn't in the Nevada
Where was it?
It was
Utah?
at that Navy base.
Yeah, that was Utah.
Utah.
No, wasn't it that Navy base down in Southern California?
Vandenberg?
I think so.
Anyway, there were some rocket tests. And so some days the tests would occur, some days they wouldn't. And the idea was to detect exactly when the test started and so on. And it was a very stressful kind of thing. And one of the things that really stood out in my mind that showed me how professional Ingo was, one day we were having an absolute roaring argument over something or whatever. And I mean, it was heated. I think he was thinking of leaving the program. I was frustrated. But then we noticed the time on the clock was timed for the beginning of a 30-minute period or whatever it was, during which a rocket test might or might not occur. And so Ingo just turned into the professional remote viewer that he was, zeroed in on it, and got it within, if I recall, like about 2 seconds. So,
No, go ahead.
Well, part of the job of a good remote viewer is to remember the details. And as I recall this particular experiment, this was a challenge to see if a remote viewer could nail to the second when a test rocket fired at a brick wall or something like that, hit the brick wall and exploded. Is that right?
When you through it, I'm going to add the detail, because I'm the one that set it up.
Oh. Well, I hope you don't differ from me.
I'm never better than you.
At any rate, it was there had to be clocks set up, but there had to be open telephone lines, and there had to be, everybody was in the same time thing, and so forth and so on. And here I'm sitting. Now, I think it hit it. That was my total contribution to that, I think. And so everybody started checking their clocks and everything, and it was within 1 second, if I remember.
This needs additional background. This occurred in July of 1977 at FTD. When I was there, a decision point came up. We had been in the program about 1 year. I was called in by the commander and to review the progress of the first year's effort with SRI. And even though we had met all the contractual agreements, the command section was getting some heat. Said, well, maybe we really should have done this or should have done that. So they told me then that it looked very likely that the program, that FTD could only stay with the program that past year. There would be no renewal in 1977. Well, you know, I was torn. I really would have liked to see the research continue, but I could understand command's decision. And I know how sensitive managers are, particularly 2 to 3 star generals, on topics like this. So that weekend, I was wandering around the area where I live in Ohio. I lived in Ohio, wondering what could be done as another type of experiment that could get their attention, that could have potential to save the program. And being kind of a canoeist, and I like to get out and walking along the river, I happened to notice these sparkling lights coming off the water, and it occurred to me, wouldn't it be interesting if the remote viewers could detect something flashing, that something very interesting or sensitive to the U.S. could not detect. Now, I had been connected with the Defense Satellite Program, the DSP. It was just being developed at the time. And I had connections with the people on that program, because we used the data from that satellite in our facility. I contacted that individual that was our liaison with this development program with the NRO, the National Recon Office. And I said, do you know have any plans to have that satellite looking at U.S. test facilities? Because I knew that once in a while they would do that. And he said, well, you really came in at the right time. He said, because tomorrow we're starting a new test with DSP the Defense Satellite Program, where it's going to be directed away from the Soviet Union to look at this test cell in the Nevada test site to see whether DSP could tell when that rocket motor went off, the same one that the remote viewers were looking at. So I arranged the details, and I created a little contest. I don't believe I ever told Hal this. And the contest was that I told to the commander was we're setting up an experiment between the remote viewers and this high new technology that's up there whizzing around the Earth in the satellite. And we'll see what happens. Well, you heard Ingo and Hal give you the results of the successful connection and detecting that blast. When I connected to get the details of feedback from my contact in the satellite program office, it turned out the defense system did not see the rocket test. It was blind to it. It was looking right at it, but did not see it. So I got that technical data together and showed the infrared sensors and the optical sensors that were looking down at that test site level. All vital signs went to zero. And I laid on top of that the data from the remote viewing contributions. And the commander just about went pale. He said, how could people do this? And our wonderful technologies up there in the sky looking down on a clear, humidless desert not see that huge blast? I said, well, you've gotten yourself a potential application here. Do you think you might find some money to renew the program? That was the second fastest contract I ever had online.
By the way, not all successful remote viewing always brings positive response, as Dale will tell in some detail tomorrow. But another one that occurred in our shop was that we had somebody who wanted us to look at atomic tests, underground nuclear tests. And so we were generating a nice stream of success on that. And then one of our lab directors that was high level in the SRI management came to see sort of the final briefing to our client. And so we went through the data, and I saw our lab manager, as I was telling these terrific results, getting more and more concerned and looking more and more upset, and I couldn't figure out, what was going on. The meeting was over, and he said, I want you in my office. So, okay. So I followed him into his office and sat down, and I said, well, what's the problem? These were great results. The client was really happy. And he said, don't you realize that putting remote viewers in the middle of nuclear tests, they might get radioactive decay, radioactive poisoning? And so he actually went to the lawyer at SRI, and they finally decided that this was too big of a potential liability. And so they said they did not want us to participate in any remote viewing of nuclear tests. But of course, we did anyway.
Hal's telling it, not me. I'm not here. No, you're not going to get in trouble.
Okay, there was a nuclear test in China, and our intelligence community couldn't figure out what had happened. All the visual assets, it seemed like a dud. It didn't really work. But other assets said they were popping champagne corks and celebrating over the great success. And so the question is, well, how can this be? And no one could figure out what the problem was. So in desperation, only in desperation often, they turned to remote viewers. And so we were asked to task on this, and this had occurred something like 3 months earlier. And so we tasked you, right? And tasked another remote viewer. And what it turned out to be was that nuclear bombs are dropped but timed to go off above the ground to have maximum effect. and that's why you see the mushroom cloud. But it turned out it was dropped in a parachute. The parachute didn't open, and so in fact it buried down into the ground, and then it went off. So the people with the visual assets who were looking for the mushroom cloud didn't see any, thought it was a dud. Meanwhile, the Chinese scientists were all very excited because it turned out that the atomic part worked, which is the one, of course, that they were interested in. And so when we put that data forward, as far as I know, that's the first time that it was understood exactly what had happened. Is that?
That's correct, yes. That was the most plausible scenario. If I recall, later there was confirmatory information on that.
Okay, so we got to move along here, or the other half of the folks won't ever get up here. So I'm going to turn it over to Skip for a minute here, and he's going to kind of give us a feel for what's happening at the unit during the early 80s. They're very early. Oh, do you want to talk? No, not yet. You're still around, Ingo. Hang on. Here you go.
Yeah, I'm still here.
As you remember, the Fort Meade unit got started when I naively suggested to my commanders that we ought to train some people to do this thing called remote viewing that I had learned about from reading Mind Reach. And silly people believed me. And as you know, I spent the next 10 years, training people. The idea was that we were going to look at this remote viewing thing at U.S. targets, at our own facilities, and then assess what the Soviets might have been doing to us in that way. But as we grew up, we started accepting foreign tasking as well. Now, what I didn't know at the time, and what my boss, whatever colonel or major I happened to be working for at the time, didn't know was that people higher than us in government were tasking both us at Fort Meade and the people out at SRI. So the Lopnor test facility, for example, was done by us too. And Ken Bell did a fantastic remote viewing of the Lopnor thing. And an interesting story to go along with that is that to find out about how nuclear weapons work, you have to have what's called a CINWITI clearance, or a critical nuclear weapons design information clearance. So we could not be given feedback on the drawings, the detailed drawings that Ken Bell provided, because we didn't have a clearance to know that he had drawn an accurate nuclear weapon in the construction. So we were actually being tasked by that time in the early 80s with various and sundry tasks from DOD. Dale, of course, was the liaison down at the DOD office that was in charge of us at Fort Meade, because we had moved over to DOD at that time. But tasks were funneled through him from various and sundry agencies, and we also had tasks within the Army that were coming to us. Now, when you're in the Army and you're not fighting a battle, you're practicing to fight a battle. So there were ongoing operational things going on, and a logbook maintained for those operations, and then there were continuous training sessions. So we kept everybody busy. When they came to the office in the day, there was something planned for them to do. It might be further training sessions, it might be doing an operational session, it might be serving in some different role. We tried to have the remote viewers serve to analyze the data of other remote viewers on projects that they didn't work in, so that they became well-rounded in what was going on. And then, of course, there was the beginning of Ingo's famous CRV training that we got started in as well.
Okay. Hal and Ingo, what time would you put on when you started putting CRV together?
In 1975, Puthoff and Targ had put together a wonderful paper called what was it called?
Which one, the AAA paper?
Yeah, the AAA paper. Perceptual channel over blah, 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 over kilometer distance.
Yeah, perceptual channel for information transfer over kilometer distances.
This, did you get that? I'm going to show a picture of it tomorrow. This was a summation of the basic exploratory work at SRI, which Russell and Hal progressed through beginning in 1972 until 1975. And basically, it was a collection of, I think, 225 volunteer remote viewing experiments based upon so-called experienced psychics and inexperienced psychics. And this was then presented at the 1976 meeting of the Institute of Electrical and, what is that?
Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers.
And it was based upon this paper that many people, including many scientists, now accepted that this channel for information transfer over distances did exist. And there were certain, it had certain flaws in it. It was robust sometime and not robust in other times. And so the clients at that time said, well, we can't be bothered with this unpredictability, but Puthoff and Targ begged some more money so we could find out. Actually, Dr. Puthoff reinterpreted the future by saying we should do research on the signal-to-noise ratio within this channel, which more or less put the future of the project over into information theory rather than in parapsychology theory. And so in order to try to find out if we could improve the channel by deleting the noise, we had to undertake to discover where the noise came from. And it's when we did discover that the noise came from the viewer, not from the target, that we knew we could probably train the viewer to recognize, self-recognize his or her own noise inputs. And that was the beginning of the training, and I think that was ongoing started up in 1976. And certainly by 1977, we were working on that very hard. So that's my recall of it. And of course, it's the most correct recall.
I want to add a little background. He blithely talked about us publishing a paper in the IEEE, but here's a good example of the politics and the science response. Russell and I had both been IEEE members for some time. We'd both published in the IEEE. We were known in the IEEE as being, quote, real scientists. And then suddenly here comes this paper that we published. And so at that time, the Director of Communications for Bell Labs, Bob Luckey, was the editor for the IEEE. So he sent it out for review. He basically got two kinds of review. One group said, oh, this is great stuff, publish it. A quote from one of the reviewers on the other side was, this is the kind of thing I wouldn't believe in, even if it were true. And so he didn't know what to do. So in our frustration, Russell and I came up with the idea, well, tell you what, Bob, we'll come to Bell Labs, we'll address your technical staff, because that's what you're worried about, how are the technical people going to respond? And if they like it, publish it. And if they don't like it, don't publish it. So we got an invitation to go to Bell Labs. They had about 300 of their engineers and staff people there. We presented the data that eventually was published in the paper, and it was a great response. They were very, very interested and challenged and stimulated by what we had done. So we met with Bob and said, well, I guess that sort of settles it. And he says, oh, I don't know, I'm still concerned about it. Well, by this time, which I'll discuss more in my talk, we had learned that a lot of people can do this, even if they've never thought about it. So we said, look, do some experiments in Bell Labs. And if your experiments work, publish it. And if they don't, don't. Well, it turned out he had a secretary who thought she was might be pretty good at this. So for a week or two, he would go out every lunchtime and pick a new spot someplace near Bell Labs in New Jersey, and she would describe where he was. And she did a terrific job. And so finally we got the phone call saying, okay, I give up. We'll publish it. And I've talked to him since, and he said publishing that paper gave him the worst problem he could possibly imagine from all of his colleagues. He heard no end of flack. And so the follow-on editor, I think it was the follow-on editor, then decided, well, I'm going to somehow get us out of having promoted this idea. And so he gave, he invited Bob John at Princeton University to do a review of the area, because he had also heard he had been doing some experiments, thinking that he would come up with a very sort of negative review. And so the paper that he came forth with was even more positive than ours was, which also got published. And so that's our history of the politics of publishing in engineering journals.
The reason that Hal's describing this is to encourage you all that remote viewing is actually so easy to do that even a Bell Laboratories scientist can do it.
Can we talk about Ingo training?
I want to point out it was the secretary that did it.
So in the development of this idea of an information channel transfer, and all of you that are now CRV trained and understand the signal line, the matrix, and the stages of RV that Ingo developed, we in the Army were looking for a way to increase the cadre of remote viewers, and entered into a contract with SRI, who then subcontracted training of our Army assets by Ingo Swann in this now complete product of training stages 1 through 4, and then working with some superior people, which I think Ingo's going to talk about Tom tomorrow or the next day, people that really took to Ingo's training, really did really well in that process. So we actually entered into a formal contract then to do training under Ingo's method in the mid-'80s, and people left from Fort Meade and originally went out to SRI and did some training, and then graduated to taking trips up to New York with another group of people that came in. So we were heavily involved in the Ingo Swann designed training, which we now all know as CRV, and many people at Fort Meade went through that. Now, it's important to say, I think, that mentioned, as Hal said, there were other customers involved here that still remain in the classified realm. And Ingo visited with some of those, and Hal had clients from some of those people. So we are giving you the history that we know of and what our exposure was in this.
Wow, I wasn't paying attention. Okay, good. Okay, so where have we got it? We're basically 82, right? Isn't that when Tom started training? Tom and oh, come on, remind me his name.
Who, Rob?
Rob Cowart, yeah. It was about 82, right? I'm going to let you guys talk about this in a second, okay? No, I'll let you talk about it now.
Well, Tom McNair turned out to be the top student, but he was the one that underwent the training the longest period of time. And actually, I'd have to look at the training folders to see when he began. But certainly it was at least as early as 1979. That's my memory of it anyway. And tomorrow I'm going to show you the top of the line of his work in 4 very revealing photographs. And also one photograph from my friend Bob Durant, who underwent a quickie training course by me in 1994 or 5 or 6 or whenever it was, and eventually produced a really, well, you have to see it to believe it, so I'll let you see it tomorrow.
So, anything about how the training happened from your end?
Yeah, say that.
From my end?
Yeah, the INSCOM training, no, from your end. How did they approach you?
let's see, I recall that we gave a briefing to Army Chief of Staff for Intelligence. Thompson, right. And that seemed to be, at least from our end, what it appeared to be was that's at the point in which he was trying to make a decision whether to go forward with this. And so we went to the Pentagon, we provided data from many experiments we've done over the years, and that's when he made the decision to do it.
Undersecretary of Defense.
I think that wasn't that later?
No, that's how the INSCOM program started.
I think that was later. 'cause
Yeah, I think that was later.
Shut it down.
Yeah, LaBerge.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, I have to say that, and I guess Ingo would be the first to agree, that he was a real martinet in the training. People had to show up with their notebooks. They had to take good notes. They had lots of essays. I mean, people often think that, you know, it's just something you sort of do or in your spare time or whatever. But these people, train like hours a day for, like slaves for a year? Tom, probably longer?
Oh, Tom was like 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years. So I mean, we're talking about, you know, some people think that, you know, I ought to be able to learn to play a Chopin concerto in just a few days of thinking about it and sort of apply that to remote viewing. But the effort that went into developing the remote viewing, thousands, really, literally thousands of targets passed by these people over a year, up to 4 years of training effort, day in and day out, with operational things thrown in as well. So there's a lot of really professional quality time went into development of the program, and that was all at Ingo's behest.
I think I should bring to light one thing that's sort of getting passed over here. You know, any kind, in terms of research, any kind of remote viewing is wonderful. I mean, you can look at it and you can say, gee whiz, this exists, it probably exists, and it's wonderful if you can see just a little bit of it, you know. But in terms of turning it into an intelligence gathering tool, you have to realize that you're in competition with human intelligence, you're in competition with ELINT, electronic intelligence, and satellite spying in the sky and everything like that. So a few little scratches on a piece of paper isn't going to be in competition with these other guys that say, what do we need remote viewing for? We can read from 400 miles up. Our satellite can say what kind of a gum wrapper is in the gutter in New York City. Can a remote viewing thing compete with that? Can it? Well, it can if you get good enough at it, and if you begin to find things that all of these other intelligence gathering things cannot find, like what's going on underground, what are people thinking, what are the motives involved, what are buildings being used for that look the same on the outside. So my students came to me with the idea, well, this is going to take a week. Well, it's not going to take a week. It took at least 18 months to get a person strong enough to stand on their own 2 feet and say, I am a remote viewer, and no outside influences are going to influence me because it's going to degrade my data, right? So if you have a namby-pamby person around and you have some bird colonel saying, well, we don't want that kind of data, so then the remote viewing says, okay, what do you want? I'll give you that. That's not a remote viewer anymore. So I'm a meek, retiring person. I've always been considered an introvert before this all happened. So I had to learn how to become a lean, mean, fighting remote viewer. And did I succeed, Dr. Puthoff?
Beyond all expectations.
I hate to brag about myself, but you know, somebody has to say these things. Did I succeed, Paul?
Oh, absolutely. I still have the scars to prove it.
Okay. No, there's remote viewing, and then there's remote viewing, right? And you got to be, if you're going to be, you know, if you're just going to spy in civilian life on somebody's recipes in the neighboring perfume factory, well, that's one thing. But if you're going to do remote viewing that costs $100,000 to verify and might cost 40 lives in doing it, you can't play around. And, you know, people came to me and they said, oh, this is a little bit of psychic thing. It's not a little bit of psychic thing. It's a little bit of your receptors things. And you've got to become responsible, you've got to become ethical, and you've got to become brave, and you've got to work your fucking butt off here. I'm sorry for, oh, I speak French, you know, it just...
Okay, cutting to the chase. That moves us up roughly to 1983. Tom was right in the middle of his training in 1983. September that year is when I came on board in the Fort Meade remote viewing unit. So in theory, I haven't been up here on the stage until now, okay? So pretend like I just walked up here and sat down, all right? As long as I walk off. I walk off and...
He's going to walk off.
Oh, yeah, that's right, if you're game. I think actually his rear end is getting tired, so he wanted to go walk around a little bit.
You said a bad word too.
No, it wasn't 4 letters though. Oh, okay. Okay. And in 1983, in December of 1983, I went to the Monroe Institute. We had this little thing where we tried to send all the viewers through the Monroe Institute until that became a big no-no, but that story happens in a little bit. And that is where I first met a guy named Ed Dames. Ed had known about the remote viewing unit for some time and had actually tasked it once or twice from another unit he was in called SED. And he and I were roommates at the Monroe Institute together. And that's where I first ran into him. And the whole bus ride down to the Monroe Institute, he told me things I never knew about UFOs and stuff like that. It was very educational, and I actually enjoyed it. But he told me a lot of interesting things. We went through the Monroe Institute, some interesting things there. And then in 1984, in January, Bill Ray comes up here on the stand. Where are you, Bill? Come on up. Bill Ray, myself, Charlene Kavanaugh, now Schufelt, and Ed Dames went to SRI and for the first time met Ingo and Hal. We were getting our first remote viewing training. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to Bill, and he's going to give us a little stream of consciousness on our first experiences with that. Now, don't get carried away. He's Irish, and you got to keep that in mind, okay? Okay?
No singing.
Thank you, Mel. Most dangerous thing in the world is an Irishman with a microphone. We got up to San Francisco first, and we met shy, retiring Ingo. A terrifying experience.
Bill, I got to take that back from you.
Good.
He scared me. No, the fact is that the tape's up. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to Kent for a minute. This is a break. We'll come back and let Bill take up where he just left off. So go ahead. Are you live?
I will be momentarily.
Okay. Okay, now we are not going to keep you here forever. We're going to shoot for about 30 minutes. If at the end of 30 minutes we still haven't finished the story, and I guarantee you we will not have, we will cut it off there and continue this next year, okay? I'm dead serious, folks, I'm dead serious. That's what we did last year. And we made some progress. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to a minute to John Alexander, who has a little piece of this story that isn't widely known. And he's going to have about 3 or 4 minutes to tell us about that, and then we will go back to Bill Ray here. Here you go, John.
This goes back to 1980. And I have read Hal and Russell's paper, but as a program, I don't know they exist per se. I mean, you kind of suspect things are out there. And I was attending Command General Staff College, and so you have a lot of free time there. So I wrote an article called The New Mental Battlefield, which I then submitted to Military Review. Now, Military Review was the journal of the Command General Staff College. And it was put out, and it was the first time anything had been put out in the topic. Now, they have very specific protocols, so I wrote the article, frankly, thinking, no way in hell is this ever going to get printed anyway. Well, unbeknownst to me, and probably to them at the time, the editor of, this is where the coincidence takes over, the editor of the journal had had a major near-death experience and had experiences out of the body. So when he saw it, he really got excited about it. Not only did he publish it, but he made it the cover story, and happened to use pictures of Kirlian photography. Now, frankly, in the military, when it came out, I mean, it didn't even make a blip. But a few months later, Jack Anderson picked up on the story, and he put out this thing called the Voodoo Warriors of the Pentagon. A $6 million program is going on and all that. Now, again, officially, I don't know that any of these guys are out here, but I found out later they're real unhappy. So I'm sitting in I was assigned to the Inspector General's office in the Pentagon. And I'm sitting there one day, and I don't know if we'll mention the individual, he is public, but comes roaring into my office, pointing fingers, said, did I write an article? Yeah, I said, I wrote the article. He said, don't you know the protocols for getting clearances and all that? I said, yeah, we know the clearances, protocols. Why? He said, well, you didn't get a clearance. I said, wait a minute, what office are you from? And for whatever reason, I just happened to have the clearance papers with me. I normally wouldn't have had them. And I go, here. Oh. Now, the follow-on to that is a few years later, working in the field, we were doing PK parties. I'm doing a PK party with a group of senior officers, and one of the lieutenant colonels raises his hand, and he said, did you ever write an article called The New Mental Battlefield? He says, yeah. He says, would you like to meet the guy who cleared the article? So they had to kind of...
Thanks. Okay, that article kept coming up over the years, over and over again. It got a lot of people interested in it, and it turned a lot of people off, depending on their attitude about these things. It had a major influence in the military as far as how this particular discipline was received. So I'm now going to turn time back to Bill.
Thank you, Paul. When I earlier said that Ingo was a cruel, hard, stern taskmaster, I was lying. That was not so. Am I okay? He told me I had to say that or I had to write an essay. Yeah. Well, our time at Fort Meade was spent about half the time we were either in New York or San Francisco undergoing training with Ingo, who was a gentle, kind, sweet soul at that time, and the other half was back at the unit doing other things. And I'll address the time spent training with Ingo. I did have several advantages. First of all, Charlene was Ingo's favorite. She was his pet, and we knew that. My advantage was that Ed Dames was always saying something stupid and getting in trouble. So that took some of the pressure off me. And when he didn't, Paul would stand up and volunteer something stupid. So I just tried to maintain a low profile, which is the way I've gone through most schools, not attract attention. But real rapidly, just real quick, all of a sudden, after undergoing all this training, we were going to work our first session. And somewhere I hadn't realized that I would be doing something psychic along the way. And I can recall sitting in the room with Ingo at the other end and wondering just what the hell was I going to do when he gave me the coordinates. And he gave me the coordinates and nothing happened. I was waiting for my pen to jump all over the paper. And Ingo told me very kindly that that's not what I should be doing. And I think assigned several hours of homework that night and a couple essays, and then gave me the coordinates again, and it worked. And that was it was amazing. Yeah, it really did work, Ingo, yes. I'll pass it back to you, Paul.
Well, I think it's Ingo's
Oh,
turn.
he's going to defend himself.
I never defend. If I have to do anything at all, it's attack, attack, attack. But I don't know what, am I supposed to say something now?
Well, just comment on your impression of us coming in, whatever, if you have anything to say.
Well, the best thing about them was they were in the military and said they could take orders. Said they could take orders. And so we had to do a little work on that before we could get started. You know, taking orders is one thing. They had to do what I said exactly when I said it, and that's not the same as taking orders, right? You know, we're trying to work with the mind here. And so my mind has to do the work first for them, and then their mind gets the idea, and if they do what I say. And after we do that a few times, then their mind can do it. And that's not the same as taking orders, but it was good they tried to take orders. I told them they could not Xerox their homework or any of their essays because that belonged in the SRI room. And then 2 years later, I found out that they burnt out the Xerox machines every night. So that's not quite taking orders, is it, Paul?
Depends on who.
Don't say anything.
Whose orders we're taking.
Dig that hole deeper. Yeah, it's up to you.
Okay, we're talking about the time frame roughly
84.
on 84. Okay, let me pull that over. Yeah, from my position in the Defense Intelligence Agency at that time, I was sort of between a lot of different kinds of activities. I had my main responsibility was actually, believe it or not, straight science. I was chief of the Advanced Concepts Office, and I was responsible for identifying new ideas, new developments, theoretical, physical related, laser physics related, coming out of the Soviet Union and other countries. But in addition to that, I was given the role of coordinating and helping to manage and interfacing with the Fort Meade operational people, as well as occasionally, but not all the time, because I had other duties, relating with Hal and Russ and others at SRI. So I was in the middle of the research, helping to find the objectives for the research, and also looking at the various tasks, the various problems that were passed on through us and other places too, because at that time we had established an interagency working group, we might call it that, of select participants from the CIA and other areas. Now the CIA did not want to be an official player, so they usually had others represent them. So we had these working group meetings to help present the findings from where we could actually evaluate some of this data from the Fort Meade group, as well as explain what was going on at SRI. Now that group was eventually disbanded because some of the people involved from different agencies felt uncomfortable with the topic, and I found that this was a cycling thing. There were many times we had a lot of support. People really wanted to become a member of this group, and other times they did not. We had to really look around for balanced individuals that could handle this. We did not want to have the true believer, and there are a number of people around like that will accept anything a remote viewer or a psychic says. Nor did we want the scoffer skeptic. You cannot get anywhere with these kinds of people, and there were any number of them around at high levels. So we wanted to have a balanced, critical kind of person, one that wouldn't go to two extremes. And this is hard to find, we discovered. This type of individual is hard to find. And then there was the issue of their own image. How many aspiring people who want to get an extra star on their shoulders in the military or career enhancement, how many would want to really work in this kind of activity when it had all the potential problems associated with it from a career point of view? So it was not the easiest activity to try to bring together within the Department of Defense. And we've had the whims many times of the attitudes of the commanders. If they were favorable, and we early on in the 80s, 82, 83, 84 timeframe at DIA, we had some really tremendous management people. Some of them thought that this was the next thing to the Manhattan Project, and we really needed to spend more time in the intelligence community and the Department of Defense looking into this phenomenon. Others were supportive, but maybe not as enthusiastic. A story I'll get into perhaps tomorrow is when we ran into individuals that were not this enthusiastic about the activity. But during this time frame, we were very fortunate in our organization to have open-minded managers. And so that helped us. That helped us keep the activity going when things got rough. And then the other thing I was fortunate enough to be involved in was to actually be on the front line in some of these projects. I ran around this time through a number of very unusual circumstances. I became deeply involved in an exciting project when General Dozier was abducted by the terrorist group in Italy in 1981-82. And that's this time frame you're talking about, correct? Yeah. 81, 82? Yeah. And the initial ideas that came out of that there's going to be a potential abduction, occurred because the Secret Service had contacted our place. We had some people there that knew about the Fort Meade unit and the SRI activity. And this was right before December the 17th when the tree lighting ceremony was going to be in Washington. And they wanted to know in advance whether there was a potential threat against the president. I believe it was President Carter at the time. And one of the people from SRI actually did come up with an abduction scenario, but wasn't exactly sure where that abduction was going to occur. But that wasn't anything to do with the tree lighting. But then the next day, we got the news that General Dozier was abducted in Italy. And that led to another series of activities. And I was fortunate enough to provide the interface between the Fort Meade remote viewers and the field team. I managed to be sent to Italy. I was probably the first and maybe the only civilian. I'm a civilian physicist. I was never in the military. But I was probably the first civilian to be part of Delta Force. I didn't even know what that was at the time. But through that activity, I did get to Italy, and I did work with the inputs from the Fort Meade unit that came to the field and other inputs while I was there in working the case for trying to locate General Dozier. That was probably the most challenging, the most exciting time of my life because we were up there in not too comfortable situations. In fact, the Italians were rather hostile toward Americans in northern Italy at the time. So it is a very difficult situation to be in. So being involved in this activity, remote viewing research and applications, personally has taken me into a lot of directions. And during that time frame, there were some very exciting things going on.
One thing that was encouraging in this period was because of the line of successes that we had in many operational experiments, and the same from the Fort Meade unit, was that we were getting higher and higher profile, and so ended up briefing people at higher and higher levels, like various intelligence committees, people in the National Security Council, as I mentioned earlier, the director of CIA. And the encouraging thing was, actually, that the higher we went, it seemed like the better reception we got. So we had this thing, which we finally figured out the pattern, which was that people at the working level were often very enthusiastic about what we were doing. Then you had the mid-level managers who were worried about their careers, who were always a stopgap for us, But if we get over them to the higher level people, it was actually a very positive response. And I've wondered over the years, because there was earlier on in parapsychology an experiment that was done where, was it Douglas Dean, I think, visited a conference of corporation presidents. And he had arranged that he would have them all fill out cards for random numbers being generated the next day on a computer. And so they did it. And then he found out, as he analyzed the data, that those people whose corporations had been progressing upward scored positively. Those people whose corporations had been stagnant scored at chance. And those people whose corporations had been dropping actually scored below chance. He then went on to interview the people who had gone up out the top, and turned out that none of them particularly believed in ESP, but they all sort of went with their intuition, they followed their guts, as they said, and so on. And so that gave me the idea that, in fact, people who make it to the very tippy top, generally speaking, are probably people who are using this ability unconsciously, actually without realizing it. And therefore, that would be why, as we got toward people at the tippy top, that in fact they didn't see anything difficult about accepting this. So I found that very encouraging.
Of course, that changed later on. Okay, we're going to move to April of 1984 and invite Lynn Buchanan to come up here. I'd hoped to get Lynn up here much earlier in the evening, but we have some blowhards down at the far end of the table. Anyway, Lynn joined the program, which became known, I left this part out, became known as Center Lane in 1983. INSCOM took over control of it because a guy named William Perry, who later on became Secretary of Defense under Clinton, Secretary of Defense under Clinton, issued a memorandum. He was Deputy Director for Research and Development, Research, Development and Engineering, something like that, for the Department of Defense. And he wrote this memorandum saying that the Army couldn't use research funds to fund the remote viewing program. Well, fortunately at that time, there was a general in charge of the Army Intelligence Security Command named Bert Stubblebine. And Stubblebine basically thumbed his nose at Perry and said, okay, don't give us any money, see if we care. And he proceeded to fund the program out of INSCOM's own budget, out of his discretionary funds. It was a pretty courageous act, actually, because he's essentially going against the hierarchy of the Department of Defense in doing that. But the outcome of that was he had to change the project name from Grill Flame, which was a DOD supported program, even though it belonged to the Army, to Center Lane, which was an INSCOM-only program. That happened in '83, shortly before I came on board. Lynn came in April of '84 into Center Lane as it's really revving up and starting to go somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to pass it to him and let him talk a little bit about how he came on board and all that kind of stuff.
How I came on board was kind of strange. I have been plagued with PK incidents all my life, and have done everything I could to stop them, to avoid them, to squelch them down and all that. Well, there was an incident in Augsburg which cost you, the American taxpayer, quite a bit of money. And Bert Stubblebine had people looking for people who had certain talents. He came out to Augsburg some months after the event, and in a rather extremely scary incident, had me standing at attention and got up in my face and said, "Did you kill my computers with your mind?" And my mind was thinking, my grandchildren will be paying for computers, and I heard my voice say, "Yes, sir, I did." And I was scowling in my face, and he said, far Frenching out, he said, "Have I ever got a job for you?" So anyway, he had me go to the Monroe Institute a couple of months after that, and at the Monroe Institute, he was there at the same time. We were out walking down toward the falls together, and he outlined a program for me, and he said that he wanted me to come to this remote viewing unit, and that he wanted me to start working on the protocols for remote influencing computers to either destroy them or control them, and do this on foreign computers. Well, anyway, some months after that, I finally came to the unit on April Fool's Day and of 1984, and I walked across from the guest house to these ramshackled, condemned buildings, and I thought, this has all been an April Fool's joke. And so I went in. Bill Ray met me outside, ushered me into the building. They took one look at me, and I think their thought was, this is an April Fool's joke, right? But that's how I came to be in the unit. I spent 8.5 years there, and it's an 8.5 years that I wouldn't change for anything. If you want details of that 8.5 year period.
Not tonight, Lynn.
I have a book coming out in September. The name of the book is The Seventh Sense, and much of the experiences that I had during that unit are in that book. Other than that, I don't know what to say. I retired from the military in 1992 and from the unit in 1992. Bert and I went on to do a bunch of other work together over in Spain and in the United States. And I have continued ever since. In 95, when they effectively declassified the remote viewing project, it dawned on me. I was working 15-hour days in DC, and all of a sudden I started getting like 8 to 20 applications a day for training. It suddenly dawned on me that I didn't have to drive into DC 2.5 hours and drive back in the evening 2.5 hours and work a 12-hour day. I could make a living continuing what I really loved to do most of all, and that was teaching and using remote viewing. And I think that brings you up to date.
Well,
covers the main points.
You fired way up to the present, man. Where the rest of us are still back in 1984.
Paul said right before this, he said, we're going to start in 1982 and go forward. They started in 1982 and went backwards, yeah. There's only one other thing I would really like to say on this, and that is, and I wish Ingo hadn't left.
He's coming back.
Oh, he is? At Charlene's wedding, Ingo and I both sort of had to get away from the noise for a while, and so we were standing out in the yard, and Ingo was talking about how he was so depressed because the military and the government were not taking this technology as they should and realizing it for the value, and that they really didn't recognize what he had brought about. And at that time, I said to Ingo, you know, the government is a ship of fools anyway, and don't expect too much from them. What you'll find is that as the world learns about this and takes this on, that's where the change will be, and that's where your name will be known. And I just wanted to tell Ingo, told you so.
We're only going to run about 5 more minutes. But we are about the middle of 1984, which was a watershed time in the history of the program, particularly the operational side of the program. Because to this point, the General Bert Stubblebine ran afoul of the Army brass. There were some other things going on that didn't have to do with remote viewing that kind of got him in trouble. Not his fault, but it happened on his watch. We all know how that works in the military. But also, the brass was a little uncomfortable with the involvement that he'd gotten in this weird, bizarre, touchy-feely kind of stuff that he'd gotten into. And in fact, he essentially he ended up in having a bit of a struggle with another up-and-coming general who there's only room for one at the top, and both of these guys, General Stolbein, and I'll name him General Odom, they were vying for the one remaining slot. In fact, Bert Stubblebine, really for the good of the Army, he probably could have won the political fight if he had tried really hard, but for the good of the Army, he opted to retire from the Army at that point, rather than tear things up the way it might have happened. So he left, but what that did was leave a bunch of naysayers and critics in control. And as a result of that, the determination was made to cancel the Fort Meade remote viewing program. First, they were actually going to close it all together and reassign everybody, or totally obliterate it. Fortunately, there were enough other people in places of influence that the Army was forced actually then to reconsider and to come up with some other option that would preserve the program as it was in another entity. And Lynn wants to make a comment, and then it should go to Dale at that point.
Brian Busby was in charge of the unit at that time, and he came back from D.C. He was going to the meeting where they were to decide the fate of the unit. And he got halfway to D.C. and there was some road work and this big sign that said Center Lane closed.
I was telling that story in my book too.
That's a wonderful story. I love that. Yes, when we, DIA, and a few others, particularly an individual I suppose I can name.
He's in
Jack?
Shaw's book, I might as well say
Jack?
his name.
Yeah, Dr. Jack Ravrona, my directorate chief, he and I had a certain relationship on this topic. And we got together and charted out a strategy along with some people in our budget cycle over in the Pentagon to see whether or not we could draft the right kind of language that would get into the congressional books and submit that to the Congressional Appropriations and the Intelligence Committees. This is not an easy thing to do, particularly on a topic which is unfamiliar to many people, although we did have individuals in these committees that knew what was going on. So after considerable work, and this was not the thing that happened overnight, but it took us about a year to get the congressional committees to actually authorize that the unit per se be transferred to our agency for management and control. We call them billets, the positions that were needed for this group would then be carved out of wherever Congress carves out these things and given to us. So we were able to make that transition, take the people from the Fort Meade unit and bring them into DIA. We saw no need to move from that facility. It was such a wonderful looking place. In fact, I have a story here. We were visited by one of the supporting senators one time, and when he came up to see the building, he got out of the car, walked up the steps, and actually looked under it and said, "There's got to be a wino under here somewhere." But we liked the look of the building because nobody would have ever expected what was going on in there, and in fact, it was a good camouflage. It was so unbelievable. It's the purloined letter situation. So we got the approval to continue on with this activity. And when the language came back from the congressional committees, it actually expanded the overall scope that we had originally suggested. So we were able to not only get the people from Fort Meade back, but we were also able to expand it to include other mixes, people from other services, a mix of men and women. So we had a much larger activity after this congressional committee. So that was the big transition that occurred around that time. And from that point on until the closing of the program, it was centrally managed by the Defense Intelligence Agency.
We will actually cover that in more detail the next time we convene to do this. So hopefully you'll be here, Dale. If not, we'll tell all kinds of stories about you. Okay. What we are going to do is we're going to jump ahead a little bit because we don't know whether we'll have Hal with us or not, and whether you'll be able to make the conference next time or what. Lynn's pointing at something.
You need another chair here?
No. What I'm going to do is jump ahead and just give the mic to Hal for him to tell how he left the SRI program. I know there's a lot of stuff that happened in here that he hasn't been able to tell us about. That certainly was interesting. But in order to at least move it up to that point, I'm going to invite you to tell about that a little bit, and we'll go from there, and that will be our final segment for tonight.
Well, after all this struggling through the years, it turned out about early 1984, we were approached to expand the program and to put together a budget for the next 5 years, and basically to put together a dream program. And so this was great. Actually, we spent about a year simply working on the proposal for the next 5-year plan. And we had a lot of support at various places in the government to do that. So we did put the program together to launch the next phase. About that time, just for me personally, as a physicist interested in, I got into all this, by accident. And then I was interested in hoping that we could find out, for example, beginning with the Kogan information theory, how all this stuff worked, interested in the physics aspects. And by this time we had, 10 subcontractors, dozens of remote viewers, large staff at SRI, spending all my time doing administrative kind of things, no time doing anything scientific. And about that time, somebody came along and made me an offer I couldn't refuse, like instant doubling of my salary. I could do anything I wanted to do, et cetera, et cetera. So at that point, I really didn't exactly know what to do, because I was working on this proposal to put it forward, and on the other hand, with 5 kids and a wife, and I could certainly use the money. And so I decided that, and Ed May was there in the program, and so I knew that he could continue it. So I decided to, in fact, that once I got this proposal through and approved, that then I would leave and turn it over. Although I would agree to continue to be a consultant for another 2 years. And so, in fact, I accepted a job in Texas. My family moved here. We bought a house. Meanwhile, I was going to work every day at SRI because we didn't yet have the proposal funded. And I was certainly concerned to make sure the program went forward. And so I stayed there until finally the proposal was funded. Then I had to make my list of people to go around and say, okay, I really appreciate this, but in my case, I'm going to move on. And so that's how I came to leave the program. Nonetheless, over the time since I've left the program, I've continued to occasionally be called in to the Pentagon to give briefings. I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff tomorrow. So still an opportunity for anyone who's ever been involved in the program, one way or another, to continue to have some input when it's necessary.
We appreciate that. When we take this up again, we'll have all of us up here but Hal. And if he's around, maybe we'll still drag him up here. At any rate, I hope you all found this helpful or interesting. I appreciate your attention, and we'll resume it again next year.